Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Xalveris. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about an alternate universe of Warframe modding. Come with me on this adventure. In the ancient past, Xalveris begins, when operators had to walk uphill to school both ways, Sentinel modding was a bit different. Sentinels would not let you equip the same mods you already had equipped on your weapons, meaning you had to rank up a second copy of the mods you wanted to use in both places. For example, Serration. You needed to rank up a second base damage mod for your Sentinel's rifle and your rifles. All your rifles can share one, but your Sentinels need another one. Thankfully, this was changed, so now they can use the same copies, and those extra copies of mods are no longer necessary, though it's shocking how long this has been true, but very few people know. What if this change was taken in the complete opposite direction and to the extreme? Here we go. For each Warframe, weapon, etc., you now need to obtain and rank up a new copy of every mod you want to use. To balance this out, each mod is 100% cheaper to upgrade and buy from shops if available. For example, a single copy of Prime Target Cracker from Barrow Katir would cost 4 ducats and 1,500 credits, and then require 400 endo and 20,000 credits or so to fuse to rank 10. I'm ignoring the problem of the lower ranks that would take fractional resources. Yeah, whatever. Special single instance mods such as login primed mods and Thermia Fracture amalgam rewards have an unlimited quantity once unlocked, but you still must rank them up each individually. And then that's the premise. We've got some discussion points, which I'll talk about one by one. We're going to start with, what changes would you make to mod drop tables to make this viable? Which brings me to my first question. Can we swap mods from thing to thing? Or is a mod glued to a thing once we equip it? You see what I mean? Can I rank up one Hornet Strike and then move it from item to item? I think not. For your system to make much sense, we have to assume it's glued to that one. You need to get a new Prime Target Cracker if a new weapon comes out. If you buy a Prime Target Cracker for every weapon that could equip it right now, and then a new one comes out, you do need to go buy a new one. Obviously, there's some weird economy problems here. Like, that means that you have to buy excess of them to, like, plan for about how many pistols you think are going to come out. You know what I mean? And that's just odd. But we could have Barrow Katir visit more often if that was an issue. The core question is, what changes would you make to mod drop tables, dropping on the ground in missions, to make this viable? Now, I think the obvious thing to say would be, well, you increase them by a lot. Mods drop like crazy. And I think there's a problem. If this is going to be a coherent design, and what is the fun of this parlay if not to try to make it a coherent design somehow, even though this is Fantasyland that will never exist? The fun would be to not increase it by a whole bunch. It's going to be really hard to parse through what you got in your inventory. So it might be kind of interesting to have it be that mods drop more, of course. They kind of have to in that sense, but not much more. After all, the more you think about it, we get a shitload of mod drops in Warframe. I mean, you get a lot of copies of a lot of mods. Really, you would just need to adjust up rarer mods so that they drop a little more. That way you can equip them on more things. But that could be its own interesting form of balancing, in a way. You only get so many condition overloads, so you can put it on a few weapons. We increased its drop rate by 10 times. A lot, sure. But you still can't put it on anywhere near all of your weapons, right? And you have to go, farm a good amount of it. It's interesting, in some ways this makes progression kind of more fun in Warframe, because even very rare things now have substantial drop chance in the moment. I decide right now I want to go get a condition overload. Well, we've multiplied the drop chance by like 10 or something, and so while I still won't have enough of them for my whole arsenal of equipment, I can go get one really fast. Low drop chances, in context low, in our new system, relatively low drop chances, are now pretty high in terms of absolute time spent. And so you can go get something with a niche farming technique in a way that feels more like just picking one up, rather than having to grind for an hour and you get screwed by variance and thus you don't get one, It makes variance way less of a pain point in Warframe. For some weird specific things in Warframe, the variance of farming it out can be a real pain in the ass, and this largely removes that problem. If you increase the drop chance by a lot, but still they're still scarce. And it also interestingly balances those effects as well. What if you make something like the galvanized mods, for example, that you get from running the hard mode versions of missions, the Steel Path? What if you make those cost less, but not 100 times less? For example, what if for Barracuteer, you make the prime mods cost less, but not 100 times less? You make them cost 25 times less. They are still somewhat expensive if you were to buy them for everything on your arsenal. The way you balanced it by making things 100 times cheaper, you can just do things the same way, but you just buy 100 times as many and level up 100 times as many. It will take a very long time of clicking through things. But you could use it as a balancing component. There are some weapons where the non-prime crit mod or whatever is surprisingly not that bad compared to the prime version, and that would now matter if the non-prime crit mod is really common as a drop, but the primed one isn't. Interestingly, this would solve some design problems in Warframe, and that's kind of obvious when you think about it another way, which is we added a knob to turn in terms of balancing. We can now balance mods in a way other than you just have everything, and once you have it once, every weapon has that hanging over it for all time. You could equip a condition overload on this new weapon that came out, but discussion would be about, do you think it's worth equipping one on it? There will still be players who will say, you can farm out 1 million of them or whatever, but provided it's balanced in such a way that you really can't, and you do have to pick and choose to some extent, I think it could be an interesting aspect of the game's design in this new, I would say brave new world, but it's not brave, it's terrifying. Let's see what Xalveris has to say. So about what changes you'd make to mod drop tables. Most common and uncommon mod drops from enemies probably wouldn't require much change. We already get a ton of those drops that don't really do much. However, the various sources of rare and other rarity mods would have to be changed to make them not even more painful than they already are. A change I would already make to the current state of the game is to remove all the trash time-wasting rolls like 5,000 credit caches, but in this case I would also make the rare mods drop in multiples depending on their source. The drop rate for a rare mod will still be relatively low, but when you get it, you get like 10 copies of it. The specific quantity would be a very case-by-case basis though. Interesting, so 2 additional topics have been added. You could keep drop rates really low, but make it so you get multiples, sure. I was arguing that there was a benefit to getting more frequent drops. If you farm for the same amount of time to get condition overload, you get 10 times as many. But what you're saying is, well, you farm for the same amount of time and get 10 times as many, but you get them all at once. Whereas in my model, you can farm for the same amount of time and get 10 times as many, or you can farm for 1/10 of the time and almost certainly get 1, whereas your model maintains that variance problem. I don't see that as better on the surface. However, I think there are cases in the game where it might be, and you make an interesting point about part 2, the drop tables on like rotation-based rewards in missions. You do a defense mission or an excavation, and you get a reward, every excavator, every 5 minutes or whatever. And there are a lot of things, your drop table is so full of food coma-inducing food. I just had lunch between Parley takes that you often don't get much. Again, it's kind of a variance thing. You could fill more of those slots with mods that actually mattered. And you can kind of do a hybrid approach too. Should you want mods to remain scarce, but you get like 10 copies of a mod when you actually do get it as a drop, you could make it so the amount of time it takes to get condition overload is about the same, but in terms of variance, but you get 10 copies. But along the way, other mods drop in multiple quantities. You could make it that you get a greater variety of things, but variance remains kind of high. That's kind of interesting. It could mean that of all the diverse things in the game, you actually are motivated to, try something new if you get a very specific niche mod. It could also feel kind of special when you get a mod that is an augment for one specific weapon, because there isn't much reason you need to get more than one of it, or you introduce the mechanic of like unlocking mods if they're a login reward or something. You have an unlimited quantity once they're unlocked, but you just have to rank them up individually for each weapon. That could be kind of special in a way. And I like the idea that some mods it's like one copy and you need to get more, but other mods it's like you can print as many as you want. Oh, man, geez. Because there are so many rewards in the drop table for a lot of these rotation-based missions. So it would be very difficult to go through them all and make sure that everything is actually still worth getting, even though you're desperately waiting for your copy of a mod at all. I don't know. I really want to use this as a chance to remove variance in farming, because I just hate it. But if we assume we want rare drops in farming to remain a part of the game, which I guess they do, your solution makes sense, and you could use the extra slots, like removing 5,000 credits cash from the drop pool, and instead put in another niche mod sometimes, or a variety of them, but you get a bunch of copies when you get them. Maybe if you get a sniper mod, you'll explore snipers for a little while, for example. Or if you get only a limited number of them and then you get more, maybe you'll go build more snipers now. It could be an interesting prompt to build more different stuff in the game, which is something that I think Warframe struggles with a little at the moment. Why do you build a 20th one of this weapon or whatever, you know? And another thing is that if you have to invest in a mod for a specific weapon, that means swapping out a mod also kind of costs resources. So you might be motivated to simply make a new weapon that uses that mod. Make a sniper rifle that is gonna use sharpshooter or whatever, because you got a copy or 5 of sharpshooter. You might still swap them in too, but the resource cost isn't too bad because it's cheaper to level mods now, but I think that would be interesting. You have another spoilered out section that says, how would this change the dynamics of player progression? I picked the 100x arbitrarily. Would a different number be better? Currently, if you count normal and prime, etc. variants separately, there are the following quantities of modables in Warframe. In other words, this is how many of each type of thing there are in the game. How many is 10 copies of Condition Overload? That's what this section is. Coincidentally, there are 100 Warframes, apparently. 178 primary weapons, 139 secondary weapons, 213 melee weapons, 38 companions, 23 companion weapons, and a handful of vehicles. So how would you change the dynamic of player progression? I think by this you mean, you said I picked 100x arbitrarily, would a different number be better? To what extent do we want to think about the player gets new things at this rate and new mods at this other rate? How do we want to balance that out? Well, I think that in this new world, let's say it's 100x drop rate, right? You might not get weapons at the early game that quickly, and so you're encouraging the player early on to just use the mods they have, which is good since they don't have any mods in their weapons and might not know what they'd want to equip. They have a surplus of mods and not that many weapons. You get 10 pistol whips, you know, when you get pistol whip as a drop. And so, yeah, you pistol gambit, not pistol whip. And so sure, I mean, you can put one on all of your pistols and still have some left over, and you know where they drop. And so it's fine. And then it becomes more picking and choosing later in the game, but only once you actually know what you'd be investing stuff in. So personally, I think having it be a lot of drops is fun. Again, I'm a fan of how this would reduce the variance, but it might seem a little unfair. Is that pushing too much against Warframe's design goals? I don't know. My point is, you would get early game mods really quickly. You would get like a copy of them or know that's out there. Yeah, another thing is that this would mean you would know what was in the game a lot quicker. So you would know of the existence of crit mods and elemental damage mods and stuff much quicker if they drop more frequently rather than dropping just as infrequently, but you get more copies of them per drop. And so mods that you get as drops off of enemies, I think it would be very quickly clear, like every time you kill a Grineer Scorpion or a Hayeka Master or whatever, you get, you know, this mod that is in their drop table. I don't know. And thus, you would form more of a relationship with those effects and where you could get mods for those things than you would normally be able to. because they would so reliably drop from those enemies. I think it would be maybe good for player progression. Committing to something like that is scary, I guess. You know, you have to commit your resources to leveling a pistol gambit or a target cracker, but I feel like them being mini amounts of resource might be good. You know, the player is willing to be a little more spendy because it's not such a big ask to invest in this one copy of this mod that you don't even know if you're going to use. It's a big investment for, you know, primed shotgun ammo mutation or whatever. And that's another thing that it would affect. Toward the middle and late part of the game, the player now gets much less of a punishment for investing in niche mods. Compared to current Warframe, a very niche mod that you wouldn't use on a lot of things is much stronger of an investment than it was. You pay way less, and the fact that it's not transferable to other weapons is almost no downside because you wouldn't have done that anyway. There are a number of mods in current Warframe that I do this for, where the cost to level the mod is the same as a mod I use on 100 weapons, but I paid that cost and it's really only useful to me on these 1 or 2 weapons. And that would kind of go away. You know, I can bank that cost in those cases. So you could argue that it encourages using niche mods, especially primed and galvanized, like, you know, expensive variants, niche mods. It rewards using mods in a niche way because you would have to level it up separately anyway. Are you just going to level the thing you always level again, or pay the same-ish cost to level something new? Maybe that would encourage people to experiment more. Let's click the spoiler here, because I'm curious if it's something similar. Ooh, I think we got it. The majority of mods are used far less than the 100x multiplier I imposed, but some staples like base damage and multi-shot see use more if you need a copy for each weapon. Notably, Railjack, Riven, and Augment mods see essentially no quantity change, only becoming cheaper to rank up. The vast majority of players probably see an overall cost decrease. New players would be able to upgrade a build much more quickly since they have fewer weapons and warframes to build for. However, they'll still lack Forma catalysts and reactors. Heavily overinvested players that keep one copy of everything in the game and try to build them all might see an overall cost increase due to needing well over 100 copies of some primed and galvanized mods, but I haven't done the math. And again, I am curious if maybe an interesting, you know, emergent property would be that you simply wouldn't, you know, looking at 213 melee weapons, for example. If I have a primed mod that I put on every single melee weapon, in this system, my time playing Warframe, 10 years, 5,000 hours of time earning endo and credits, if I want to keep my builds the same way, and let's say I'm a player who's put that primed mod on 213 every single melee weapon, for some reason, by the way, there's not really a reason to do that. We're including primes and their non-prime variants, so that's weird. But let's just say I did it. I now need twice the amount of endo I've gotten in my entire history of my time playing Warframe to keep those mods on that many things. In other words, it's impossible. Like that, you cannot have that much endo. I mean, it's not literally impossible, but it would take a huge amount more time. You see what I'm trying to say? And so excitingly, to me excitingly, you'd probably pick and choose more which ones would be on which things. In such a game, you would probably include an item that let you rip a mod off of a weapon as well at some decent expense, but that could be less expensive than like leveling a whole new primed mod. And so for really expensive mods, Barokatir or whoever could come around every so often and sell a few mod rippers or whatever. And these would be items that you could use to remove an expensive upgrade from something and put it somewhere else where you want to use it more. I have a feeling this would be a good thing to add anyway in some quantity, because when a new prime weapon comes out, if you liked the normal variant, you almost get punished because you can't move your mods up to the prime variant. You could go even further and make that be something I kind of wish was in Warframe from the start, a kind of connection between normal and primed variants of weapons or other variant versions of weapons. If you have a Bratton that you have modded and a Bratton Prime comes out, because they're in the Bratton series, they would have a kind of family perk where you can move the mods up to the stronger one if you wanted to. Something like that. And I think that would already be very fun, welcome in Warframe. So maybe, excuse me, oh. I'm sorry, I hope you can tell that I'm not at all bored by this Parley. It's interesting. I'm just very tired. It might even be interesting to let you move mods freely around between weapons. There are some weapons in their variants where multiple different versions of the weapon are pretty interesting, or like do different things. The obvious one that comes to mind is the Ceranos series of bows. There's Ceranos, Ceranos Prime, Racta Ceranos, Proboscis Ceranos, Mutilist Ceranos, and while a lot of those are not that amazing compared to the other options, they are, a lot of them, pretty different. Certainly the Proboscis Ceranos, Ceranos Prime, and Racta Ceranos, at the very least, are good and good in different ways. And so moving weapons around, or moving mods, excuse me, around between all of them would be kind of interesting. You invest in the Ceranos family of weapons. That sounds kind of fun. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that the probably the reason you were inspired to do this is to make it feel like modding a certain weapon is more of a specific investment in that weapon. You're really digging into that weapon a little bit more. It's not like you can just slap your one copy of the max level mod that you put on everything onto every weapon. It makes you pick and choose each time. To some extent, this also makes automod kind of an interesting question. Like, I think for a lot of players, the type of people some people are, the type of people are, some people would be the kind of people, confused yet, where they're gonna want to level up a different mod just because they're sick of having serration every single time, where they wouldn't get as fatigued about doing that if it was just the same copy of serration. And thus they're willing to experiment more, or are they willing to experiment less because they have to pay a separate cost now to level up some other mod and they might not get benefit out of it? Or will they experiment more because it doesn't cost that much to level up a really niche mod? It's so negligible to level up some niche mod that maybe it feels more, you know, freeing to try something new. I also imagine that trying things in the simulacrum and not locking in mods would be pretty important to a lot of people. It would give the simulacrum more of a purpose. So to recall, leveling up a primed target cracker from Barrow Katir would cost 4 ducats and 1500 credits to buy, and then the cost to level that primed mod all the way up is only 400 endo and 20,000 credits. Negligible. I mean, you can get that in a few minutes of gameplay, which is good because for that weapon, you need to do that, or a little bit less than that cost, about 8 times to fill out all its mod slots for every single new weapon. And so, yeah, I mean, I think people would want to test out the resources they had available. When equipping anything, even serration, to a weapon is iffy because you need to commit the cost and you're not sure if the weapon is going to do good damage. Maybe people will try things out more and thus notice that there are other interesting options when there are. The bad side of this is that Warframe is already a game where there actually aren't that many good reasons to not just use serration or the same mods on every single weapon. And therefore, you're asking players to put even more thought into a system that is kind of artificial complexity. You know, you can just put the damage multiplier mods on and things will do good damage. So abadabadab, not sure that's a win there. But I don't know. I'm very curious at the very least how it would affect players choosing different things, like weird stuff. I don't know, but it would be really interesting to see. Would it make players choose, yeah, like more irregular things, or would they choose the same thing even more religiously or whatever? Because they feel locked in otherwise. And mechanics that make them more or less locked in would definitely feel different. I am very interested in this idea about just how many places you would use a certain mod. You know, this makes me think, looking at my own Warframe account, for example, just how often am I using a certain, like, what I think is a common mod, but that I don't equip every single time. You see what I mean? I could predict, you know, the top ones are going to be base damage and multi-shot nearly every weapon. There's almost no, especially multi-shot, there's almost no reason not to use multi-shot unless the weapon simply doesn't use it. There's not really anything a weapon could do where multi-shot wouldn't make it better at doing that. But some weapons just, it doesn't apply. And base damage, if the weapon is going to do any damage, that mod is almost always the biggest damage increase. Crits if they have crit, but that's going to be a lot less common. Now, status chance and elementals will probably be more common than crits, but there are more mods that give me that. So, a question again. I mean, I guess Toxin as an elemental, it builds into corrosive, viral, and gas, is probably the most populous now. We're in a tricky part of Warframe's history in that way because we've just gotten some changes to enemy resistances, weaknesses, and also things like Blast's status effect changing, which we've been playing with a lot in the stream around the time I'm recording this. So that'll probably change quickly, but at the moment, I would say it's fairly predictable that I bet the Toxin elemental mod, the 60-60, a little bit of toxic damage, good amount of status chance, I bet that elemental for most weapons is the third most commonly used mod for me, because it's a little bit more common than crits that a weapon is good, but in a way where it doesn't have crit chance. I bet that's a tiny bit more common. And nearly 100% of the time I'm building an element, Toxin is there somewhere, or it was at the moment. Again, this is coming at a slightly weird time in Warframe's history. So that's probably the third most used thing. And then crit mods, or like even for crit, like there are some variants. Like we've gotten the you lose fire rate, but you get a bit more crit chance. And then some weapons, the loss in fire rate can be noticeable, but a lot of the time the extra crit chance is pretty worth it. So crit mods might be surprisingly divided. This doesn't massively matter in the sense that for a lot of, like, those mods aren't expensive to level. They're only 3 or 5 levels, which in this system, where we've reduced the cost to upgrade mods by 100 times, leveling a mod that has 3 ranks costs an almost unmeasurably small amount of resources. Like, that's almost free. You could make them free, though it would add up over time, of course, because you're leveling these hundreds of times, potentially. And again, there are some weapons where I'm using a primed or galvanized variant of a mod that has 10 ranks, often enough that if you doubled the amount of those in the game and only made it 100 times cheaper, thus making my total cost to outfit every single weapon about double what it currently is, I simply wouldn't be able to do it. I, as a human being, wouldn't have had enough time in my life to have acquired the amount of endo required to put it on every single weapon. And I think very few players would have that amount of time. I think it's easy to underestimate that too. Like, you're doubling the amount of time people are playing Warframe. For many people, that is worse than it sounds. It sounds like, maybe, couldn't I just not play a lot of other games? A lot of other games. I mean, you'd be real different. I don't know. That's a big thing. So, I don't know. I think for my ideal version of the system would be one where it creates a situation where people don't use those mods on every weapon. Or maybe you even aren't allowed to have more than so many copies of a mod among your weapons. This is getting a little weird, but I'm not sure what else I'm meant to do with this parlay. I think it's fun to speculate, so I hope that's okay. I thought this was a really compelling premise, Xalveris. At first I thought, yeah, what are you doing? But it surprisingly works out kind of okay, and there are some interesting consequences. So I am going to play around a little bit and go a bit further. Maybe adding a limit to how many copies of the mod can be among your weapons would be interesting, and then you have to kind of tactically eliminate a copy, delete a mod that's on one of your weapons to make more room. You could add that into current Warframe. You could make a limit that's like, you can't have condition overload or whatever on like more than so many of your weapons, but it would feel like a weird limitation because all you need to do to change that is just to micromanage moving it around a lot. You know what I mean? You then have to add in some kind of system where you lock in what your loadout is every season, and oh look, we kind of created Path of Exile. So maybe it's better that you need to invest in each of them so you can't just micromanage move them all around, and thus you have to carefully invest. Does this weapon really want condition overload or not so much? This could add fun to the game. It would make people think about when it's really good instead of feeling like it's always just the best option. And it might make some players notice that at the moment in Warframe, many weapons have more than 8 mods that you would say are obviously really good, this is the best one, but there are more than 8 of them, so you do have to pick. and dramatizing that choice, saying, what is your logic, player? Is this one of your weapons that you think is in the top percentile of synergy with condition overload? And then they have to choose. Could be interesting. Like, that sounds cool. I don't know. But I guess I digress, because that gets into the dangerous territory of trying to get players to like making builds if they don't. And maybe putting this pressure on them is not the right way to do it anyway. Whatever you gain in encouraging players to really think about which weapons are really good, you would lose again in making players afraid of making the wrong decision and wasting resources. But again, I'm not sure about the psychological effect of it being so cheap to level up mods. That might make people really okay with just like doing the best they can. Or it might make them even more worried because they're getting nickel and dime to death. Looking at how people manage their money a lot of the time, I have a lot of fun with this because I've spent a lot of time doing it with myself and people in my life, and my dad is also by trade is an investment advisor. And so thinking about the way people do spend money, the thing you'll know if you've dipped into the subject at all is that people are very vulnerable to getting nickel and dime to death. People are really bad at keeping track of that type of expense. They tend to say, oh, if this is cheap now, I'm somehow saving money, when in fact buying the nicer thing and just not buying it again because it's a nice product is often a better way to save money, even in the medium term, even for people with very little money or cash on hand. And humans are just not very good at this. And so there was some statistic recently where if you've saved more than something galling like $600 on hand, then you're in the top third of financial well-being among people in America, which is kind of terrifying. Like, most people don't have, again, I forget exactly, but something like $600 on hand, so between paying for all their bills and their, luxuries and etc., there's less than about $500, we'll just round, cushion that is keeping them afloat. Like, that's crazy. I feel like if you make it's not that hard to save like a little bit of money. Come on. Anyway, I don't want to criticize anyone's financial position really, because mine is not so far off, but I'm certainly a little better off than that. That's rough. Anyway, the point being that I think people are nickel and dime to death in the real world, and therefore I have a feeling that people would see the leveling the individual mod cost as negligible, but then be confused why they ran out of credits. I would predict that would be the outcome. People will play fast and loose, will open up, maybe will experiment with builds more, but then also will run out of credits and endo. So I'm not sure that's totally a win there, but then we're not changing Warframe to be like this, so I guess it's fine. I don't know. I mean, again, it's a weirdly compelling idea. Warframe's build system makes me so eager to do something like this. I totally get why you did this parlay. It makes me want to just throw caution to the wind and make it be something crazy. So yeah, I thought it was a fun concept. As a closing thought, it makes me think about arcanes as well, where you already get a lot of copies and kind of fuse them into one. I would be interested in a system where you keep the arcane drops the exact same. You can see where I'm going with this. And you don't need to level them up by stacking a bunch. But you just, they're consumed, they're locked to that weapon. And so if you want an arcane, target cracker, I don't remember the names of arcanes for some reason, arcane arachne for one Warframe, you don't need 21 arcane arachnes to get the full effect, but you do need to commit this one to just this one Warframe. And so how does that divide them up? How do people think about, arcane energize or something? And you can probably see what I was trying to do earlier with my thing about limiting how many weapons or Warframes can have an upgrade on them. I think arcane energize would become fun instead of something that kind of smooths over the game's complexity for a lot of people, if you could still use it, but just only by committing it to one Warframe at a time, and it was meaningfully difficult to remove that commitment. You see what I mean? The hard thing is that it's frustrating if the resource you use to remove something locked to a piece of equipment, like you remove your arcane energize that you committed to your Garuda or whatever. Don't do Garuda. Whatever Warframe. If it's hard to get the thing that lets you remove the thing, that encourages you to pick wisely where to put it. But at the same time, it causes a parallel problem where you could run out of them. So I propose a form of farming that I kind of wish was in more games, which is when you have a resource like that, let the farm to get it become slower and slower. You can get as many of them as you want, but the more you get within a certain interval of time, the slower they are to drop. For example, every month this resets. And to get the thing that lets you remove something from a weapon, the first one takes a minute of being in this mission to get, then a minute and 20 seconds, then a minute and 40 seconds, then a minute and 2 minutes, then 2 minutes 20 seconds, etc. And it doesn't exponentially increase, but the amount of time to get up to the next one will be increasing steadily. And so you can always get more, and not for an insane amount of time commitment, but you always want to not go get more if you can help it. And thus you have an incentive to choose wisely where you put this one upgrade, but you're not trapped with it there if you don't like where you chose it. This is the kind of thing that if you put in Warframe currently, players would hate it. They would hate it. Even though, if you magically erase their memory that it was ever different, a lot of players would find the decision they'd need to make compelling. They just wouldn't agree to be put into that situation. But if they were in it, I think a lot of players might surprisingly enjoy the decisions they're making there. This is a place where game developers are having you kind of take your medicine a bit, but it really does lead to an interesting limitation. I bet there's a way around that, though. I don't know. I mean, I like the idea that you have to kind of commit and make this thing your way, and you have an idea for it, and you kind of sit in that idea for a while. You're not just immediately switching to something else. But I know for a lot of players, it would feel like that's just too much pressure. I don't want to do that. And it becomes a pain. And experimenting becomes a pain. The simulacrum letting you experiment without locking stuff in does something about that. But maybe this is just me and a lot of players don't like this. How did you like our heretical vision for the future of Warframe? Xalveris, thank you very much for the parlay. Folks, if you want to get your own, you can check how to do that in a link in the description. Talk to you all soon. Looking forward to the next one.